Thanks very much, Leas Corla. Last night, RTE showed Mariupol, the people's story. What struck me about this programme was the beauty of the magnificent modern city. Stunning parks, impressive architecture and town squares, every bit a modern European city. A thoroughly beautiful place to raise a family, live and work in a harmonious melting pot of cultures and beliefs. Heartbreaking stories were told in detail by ordinary people, and I don't think anyone could remain unmoved by the plight of the Ukrainian people, particularly after viewing this programme. And I think it should be noted that this was handled in a very sensitive and constructive way, in fairness, by RTE. I'm also really glad that we're actually having this debate today and that time was given to this. I think it's important we continue to hold constructive and open conversations on how we are going to tackle the situation. And it's also important for government to really listen to the opposition, and also, really importantly, those who are working in this field, who I believe have come forward with really constructive suggestions to improve the state's response. On a personal note, my own family has a very strong history of emigration and immigration. My dad, as many people know, was born and grew up in the South Bronx in New York. His own parents had emigrated over to New York. They always had this dream and wish to move back to Ireland, and unfortunately it didn't work out for them. But after he'd served in the US Navy during Vietnam, he then moved back to Callan, which was a bit of an adjustment, I'm sure, from New York City. But that's obviously where we grew up, and my own sister now lives in New York, so we grew up constantly with the back and forth, and I can't imagine it have been any other way. And I say this because, as we know, and many people in this chamber have that same history of emigration. I do think the Department of Children have been well and truly left holding the bag in relation to this. I don't believe that we're seeing this whole of government response that we constantly hear about, but it's not being experienced on the ground. And I do think that the rise in the very right-wing protests is largely down to this complete and utter mishandling. And I would just take the opportunity to remind people that it is not the fault of those fleeing horrific wars and situations that have caused any issues within our health services and housing situation, but there is huge anger and frustration at the government's dealing of the situation, and unfortunately it's joined a long litany of disastrous decisions made by this government and previous governments. Much of the nexus of this can be found in the housing emergency, which is decades in the making and has had a disastrous impact on so many people, families, communities and social groups. And I think probably everybody in this chamber knows somebody directly impacted by the housing crisis. Families in overcrowded and unsuitable accommodation, we have endless social housing waiting lists, exorbitant rents. They're just to name a few of the issues, and we really do need to see government finally starting to take action on housing. What this crisis required and still requires is an escalation and focusing of minds similar in scale to what we saw with our response to COVID-19. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that the Department of Children is the one that's left kind of dealing with all of this, and I think it's been extremely damaging to that department. In October last year, the Refugee Council released a report on Ireland's accommodation crisis and its ability to adequately respond to the unprecedented challenges the war in Ukraine would present Ireland over the coming months and possible years. Their first and chief recommendation was prioritising medium and long-term planning, and 5 months on from their report, we are still jumping from crisis response to crisis response. They highlighted a protection system that is in crisis. In 2022, approximately 70,000 refugees from Ukraine arrived in the state, in conjunction with a marked increase in the number of people seeking international protection from other countries. These trends have continued unabated, with an additional 4,500 arriving in the state since the start of the year, and most NGOs who are working in that area will put the figure of inward migration at around 900 people per week, which will continue. The government has said time and time again it's close to exhausting accommodation options, yet I know of several really suitable locations in my own constituency who have had huge buy-in from local community, and in some cases are looking forward to welcoming children into their local schools and sporting clubs, and they have just not been followed up. And I imagine that is the same for nearly every TD in this chamber. I don't doubt these locations obviously have to be scrutinised, and nobody is saying that that doesn't need to be done, yet what is happening on the ground is literally no follow-up. And there is several spaces in both Carlow and Kilkenny that have actually been visited by local authorities, have done the various fire regulations and all that needs to be done in relation to that, and they've contacted the department time and time again with no reply. So, I mean, you know, when we say really one department, it isn't sufficient to deal with the situation. That's why because there hasn't been any further communication with people or organisations. It's just so unacceptable and is feeding really into all of that negativity. The Refugee Council highlighted in stark terms the downward trajectory we were heading on from the completely broken direct provision system to emergency accommodation to transit centres, including people sleeping on floors and chairs, to tents, to no accommodation at all, which is what we reached recently when people were literally handed vouchers for €25 and told, sorry, there's no room here. We absolutely cannot allow this to become the new normal. I don't buy that there's been a whole of government approach, as I've said already. The problems have remained within the confines simply of the Department of Children, which just isn't equipped or empowered to address all policy areas relevant to any adequate response. As my colleague, Deputy Pa Daly, just spoke in relation to the white paper on ending direct provision, numerous agencies, including ourselves, have called on you to recommit towards implementing its recommendations, and I strongly believe when there is political will, people will mobilise to progress improvements. We cannot continue to operate public services on a constant rolling crisis basis. Addressing this emergency requires us to develop new tools to tackle challenges. There is a wealth of expertise and experience. People who are working in this sector, I know, are extremely frustrated that their ideas and recommendations are not being taken on board and that they're not being consulted with as well, because they really have so many very good recommendations, in particular the Irish Refugee Council. So finally, just to finish on a positive, there was a very good welcome rally in Kilkenny last Sunday. Minister Malcolm Noonan was in attendance as well as people from People Before Profit and the Labour Party, trade unions, community groups, and it was a really good and positive event, and it was great to see so many people turn out. And I say this because the vast majority of people really want to help and really want to be part of a positive experience for people, and they want to be welcoming. As I have already referenced, we have a very long history of emigration as far back as the 1850s, probably even before, which has enriched countries, communities and families throughout the world. We have a thriving diaspora in nearly every country in the world, and one that everyone is proud of. So it's incumbent on all of us to welcome people, particularly those displaced and dispossessed, and provide them with an opportunity to rebuild their lives and enrich this country. And very, very briefly, last Concord, I just want to say that the Children's Committee is particularly looking at this issue over the next few weeks as well, and I'd encourage deputies to attend those meetings. Thank you.